Well, I'm just going to apply a little bit of molybdenum paste to the centre of this settings lever and a wipe on the back, just for good measure. You don't do any more than leave a dirty mark on there typically, you don't need much. And this should go on the shutter somewhere on that side. Put that on my jig while I'm assembling it to make it easier to see what's happening. And the plate goes on here and is held in place. This two screws hold the pieces together. Now, one of these screws was loose when I took the camera apart, which hopefully just meant it was loose and not stripped out. That's tightening up. That's tightening up, so they are good. They're in good order. Well, that moves smoothly, there's no problem there. And now I'll lift my diaphragm assembly back onto the jig. Hopefully I haven't disturbed the position of anything. And I've got to get my case over that so that those rivets fall into these slots at the appropriate place. And normally, were this a Seikosha-Rapid, I'm just looking at this now, that case certainly goes that way up. And normally I would have that lined up about there and lower that into position. And I've got to get it over those little rivets somewhere about there. I'll give that a wriggle, see if they'll seat. I think they're okay. Flip this over. Well, things have moved out of place because I can see that some of my little pivot points are not sitting correctly. I'll get the screws in to hold this very loosely in place and see if I can manipulate those blades into position. Must have disturbed those blades in lifting the plate on and off the jig to use the jig for the other job. That's the third of the screws. I'm doing them up very lightly indeed, and I'm looking to see how these pivots are. Now on this side all the pivots are correctly in position, so I've tightened that screw up just a little bit more. This one, and this one is slightly out. That's just popped into place. That's popped into place. So the ones over here are all good. Two here are out of position. One of them looks good. The other not so much. Oh, there it is, it's just popped in. So I'll tighten those screws up a little bit more. Not doing them up tight. So all the blades are in their pivot points on the backing plate, on the retaining ring there, but I can't get my lever to shift, so either I've got it in the wrong position or some of those blades are not sitting in the slots correctly. So let's back these screws up very slightly. Yeah, something just popped into place then, and I can see I've got my lever in the wrong place. I've got it round the wrong end of the track, so I'm going to have to redo this, which means taking out the screws, because being stubborn I don't want to go back to the start. Pop my jig back on, flip it over, lift the case off, move the lever to the other extreme of the position. Where am I? Just got to line this up carefully. There and there, there and there. If I give that a little wriggle, it might drop in. It is. Lift my jig off again, flip it over. Get the 3 screws back in place, and hopefully I've done it right this time. Of course, I still don't know whether the blades have dropped into their slots correctly, but we'll find out very shortly. And hopefully I didn't accidentally move the lever back the wrong way while I was organising stuff. That's it. Okay, so that all went, it's all happened, and it's all working. I'll just tighten up the screws. Check the action, make sure it remains smooth. It has. And those 2 screws that I tightened previously are still tight, so that's all good. That's the shutter case dealt with. The blades are all clean now, they move freely. Importantly, there's no oil or grease on there, so they shouldn't come to any grief. They're not going to get sticky and get damaged. I'll need to look at my mechanism plate. Now, the mechanism plate on the other press van that I worked on had 6 blades. I'm looking to see how the blades are arranged, see if they're arranged in a similar fashion to a compur. A compur would have had the first blade in this position, second, third, fourth, fifth, and a cover blade there if it was going to be a 6th. This one, either this is maybe the first and the last. I'm going to lift that blade off and see if that's a 5 or a 6. It's a 5 blade. That's 5 then. 4, 3, 2, 1. Alright, so that was my 5th blade there, 4th blade here, 1st blade here. So I've made a mark so I know where those go back. The shutter blades themselves are all identical. On contour shutters, the first blade is usually identified with a little extra hole. The hole serves no other purpose than just to identify the first blade. So here, I can unhook that spring, undo this screw, when you've been doing contours for so long, you expect to turn things a certain number of times and for things to pop off. You get puzzled, you don't expect to see screws that are slightly longer doing the same job. Right, so that was the lever from the top of the shutter that moves this blade actuating ring. The blade actuating ring's job is to swivel the blades in and out. We have 3 screws holding this retainer plate in place, and that was loose, that was not very tight, and that one was not very tight. If these screws come loose, what can happen is that they will back up and catch the edge of the shutter blades and either prevent it swinging open or prevent it swinging closed. So here's the cover plate, here's the blade actuating ring, the piece that pulls those blades around, and here's the mechanism plate stripped down. Now on the mechanism plate there's nothing here of interest except the retard gear train. The retard gear train, the pallets are worked by this lever, and just swinging that I can see that they do not swing back to the rest position. So this is sticky. Normally when that's swung out like that, you'd swing this lever and the pallets would automatically swing in. This is sticky, it doesn't. So this needs flushed with some naphtha. Either I could take it off and put it in an ultrasonic cleaner or clean it in place. And typically with these shutters I clean it in place because getting the adjustment of these right is very difficult. And if it was set right previously, once it's cleaned it'll work correctly again. So I do not go looking for trouble by creating work that doesn't need to be done. If it's very bad, if that speed train is very gummed up, then yes, I would take it off and it would get a good go in the ultrasonic cleaner, and then I would have to set the timing up. So I'll just flush this lot out and clean that mechanism plate up. So running some naphtha into the speed train, I hold back the pallets with my finger and work that lever inwards and outwards, let that thing swing back, and all that's happening is I've loosened up any oil or dust that may have been sticking anything in here, and it's the oil that's usually the menace. It loses its volatiles over time and gets sticky, but the naphtha will dissolve it away. It'll act as a solvent and dissolve it away. So when everything's nice and free running like that, I need to blow that naphtha out of the shutter so it takes away any oil. If you apply plenty of naphtha, work it backwards and forwards, and then just leave it to evaporate away, you'll be left with the original oil that you had previously loosened up. Now that speed train looks a bit dirty on the top. It's still sticky. It shouldn't stick out there. It may have to do with the position of the spring. It may be binding up. it certainly doesn't want to automatically drop back apart. There's not much in it. There'll be something stuck in a tooth somewhere. There'll be a bit of speck of something, I'd say. Yeah, it's pretty something's a bit touchy in there. I'll carry on cleaning that plate up, quite possibly with a bit of graphite powder in the appropriate place. That problem will immediately disappear, never to return. But I'll have to see. I certainly don't want to assemble a shutter with an intermittent problem. And underneath the mechanism plate, of course, that all needs to be nice and clean. The outer part, the shutter blades will bear across. The inner part here is the blade actuating ring will run in that little recess. We need it all to be free and clean. Right, let me try a little bit of graphite powder on that speed train and find out what happens. Well, I've discovered what the problem was, and the gear, that little tiny pinion on this shaft here, has about 10 teeth. One of them is damaged, and it's right at the end of the stroke of this, and that's what's stopping it from running back. Now that doesn't move a full circle. I think I can move this by one tooth if I remove this screw and stretch the case, and that should hopefully solve that problem. But it is something mechanical, and it's something broken. I don't have to do anything too drastic to this. I only need to remove it from the body of the shutter, and that'll allow me to disconnect the arm at this point, move it over one tooth and reconnect it. Hopefully that'll do the job. Well, I took it off, put this moved that a tooth or so, and as you can see it works perfectly now. So that was an unexpected thing to find, that there'd be a broken tooth on a pinion. It's just fortunate that it's a pinion that doesn't revolve 360 degrees. And so I was able to position things so that it never actually meshed with the gear. And that's all working perfectly. Of course, it does mean I'll have to make my adjustments for the speeds on here, which was something I'd been avoiding as much as I possibly could. But that's life as we know it. So I'll clean up the other components of the mechanism plate and put them back. I'll just get everything back on here, well on the underside here anyway. So I've got my blade actuating ring. It just drops on there, and the retainer plate which sits on here, and that should be located by a little pivot, a little rivet which drops into a slot, and it does. So it's very similar to the Seikosha-Rapid shutters. Get the 3 screws in place. Once they're all in place, you can tighten them up You're best to get them all in place and then tighten them up. If you just put one in and tighten it, you'll inevitably find that things aren't lined up correctly by the time you get to the second one. So that's all free, and I want to lubricate that with a bit of graphite powder. It could also be lubricated with molybdenum paste, and I did have cause to do that on a shutter just recently. So I'm cleaning the little lever from the top of the shutter that swings that backwards and forwards, and its retaining screw. Now normally that lever I just a little white with molybdenum in the pivot hole and in that slotted hole where it couples to the lever. And you're never using much of that stuff, it just leaves a little dirty mark. You've got enough on there. Where has the screw gone? There it is. I'm probably looking for the wrong colour, because normally that would be a nickel plated screw on a contour shutter, and of course here it's black. Check that that swings in and out. As it swings in and out, of course, it swings the blade actuating ring backwards or forwards. I'll hook its return spring into place. Now I notice that the return spring is notably stronger than it would be on a contour shutter, which would certainly assist in closing the shutter blades, bringing the blades back to the closed position, which is part of the job, of course, of shutter blades. They have to open and they have to close, and you want both parts of those cycles to work as quickly as possible if you're after a high shutter speed. Right, I will lubricate this with a bit of graphite powder and then clean those shutter blades. Okay, with the shutter blades cleaned, I've just unhooked my return spring from the arm on the back here, swing this into the blades open position, and I can start laying the blades in place. And of course we'd marked our blade number 5 there and blade number 1 there. That's the blades in position. I should be able to fit the case over that now and then put the case screws in place. Now, the case only goes on in one position, and I think it's there. The 3 screws hold the case together. And once the screws are in place, the shutter blades can't fall out. They're retained. Very occasionally I see a camera for repair with loose shutter blades in them. And typically it means that someone has loosened screws that they should have left alone, and the blades were able to fall out. Now those screws are just loosely done up. I want to check that the blades swing into the closed position. They don't. It's jammed up, so something has moved out of position. I never do those screws up tight in case something is shifted and the blade is trapped between the case and the mechanism plate, and then of course it would be liable to damage. You see what's happening here. I think that was assembled with the blades in the blade closed position, almost. That's what it looked like. Yes, it was. Looking at the way these blades catch the light, they're a little bit more marked than I would normally prefer them to be. I may choose to polish these with a bit of brass. But just for the moment, let's get this thing assembled. I want to see it assembled and working. Here we go. There's the case, and the case goes on about there. Line up the 3 holes, put the screws in. I think this camera dates from about 1952 or 53. Yeah, it's got a few, it's got a few miles on the clock. Oh, that certainly swings in. It's nice and snappy. Yeah, but those blades are marked. I'm going to choose to take those out and polish them and put them back, I think. The marks on the blades, sometimes that's due to staining from oil, and the volatiles all go, you're left with like a lacquer. Sometimes the marking is something like that. Other times it's surface corrosion. I'm not sure which I'm faced with here, but I will take those blades and polish them carefully. I do not like polishing these blades. Each of these blades is 2 pieces. There's a reinforcing. Those brass rivets you see, they hold a reinforcing plate on this side. And polishing them is tricky because the polish gets in between the 2 plates and it's hard to flush it all away afterwards. But I think I'm going to have to try. So I will polish these and bring you back once everything's assembled.